Today's podcast is one that I've been excited about for a very long time. We're going to be diving in on the book Extreme Ownership. It's the 10-year anniversary of this book being published. So I'm recording this podcast in October of 2025, and this book was published in October of 2015. And if you know me, you know that this book and Jocko Willink and his podcast, the Jocko podcast, have had a very significant effect on how I think and how I operate in the world. And the book lays out 12 principles to help teams lead and win and just dominate the space that they are in. And I obviously fall short in striving to live out these principles on a daily basis, but the framework that Jocko laid out and his work on his podcast of reading books from historical figures in the military and in business and mapping all of those lessons and stories to these 12 principles has been very useful for me over the past decade, as I've listened to probably over 1,000 hours of Jocko's podcast over the years. I mean, there's plenty of podcasts I've listened to multiple times. So as I've been going through different books and studying people on this podcast, we've studied Jensen Huang, Sam Walton, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Naval Ravikant, John D. Rockefeller, and a bunch of others. One of the things that I'm always doing as I'm going through is I'm trying to understand the lessons learned and understand the principles that they're operating under. And oftentimes I find the principles laid out in the book Extreme Ownership being shown or talked about by those figures, right? By Steve Jobs, by Elon Musk, by Rockefeller, and all these different people. So what I wanted to do on this podcast was go through the 12 principles laid out in Extreme Ownership, talk a little bit about Jocko and Leif's commentary on them, and then tie some of my favorite stories that we've studied on the podcast so far and learned about in these different books and from these different people, and map those on to the 12 principles of Extreme Ownership. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be going through those 12 principles and taking stories from all the different people we've studied on the podcast that kind of show us what these principles look like in action. So with that, first thing I wanted to do is just break down kind of the structure of this book. So like I said, there's 12 principles and they are broken up into 3 different sections. The first section is called Winning the War Within. And so that's the first 4 principles. That covers extreme ownership, no bad teams, only bad leaders, believe, and check the ego. So those are all principles that are really supposed to be the fundamental building blocks and the mindset that's necessary to lead and win. The second set of principles, the next 4, is what Jocko calls the laws of combat. This is probably, if you listen to the Jocko podcast, these are the 4 that he references most often, and he calls these the critical concepts that enable teams to perform at the highest level and dominate their space. And so the 4 laws of combat are cover and move, simple, prioritize and execute, and decentralized command. And then the last 4 principles are in the third section called sustaining victory. And this section discusses some of the more nuanced and difficult balance that there is that leaders have to navigate in order to maintain the edge and keep teams kind of perpetually operating at the highest level. And so those 4 principles are plan, leading up and down the chain of command, decisiveness and uncertainty, and discipline equals freedom. And one of the interesting things that Jocko and Leif do is the way they wrote this book for each principle, each one of the 12 principles, they give a military example. So an example from their experience in the military that highlights that principle. Then there's a little principle section that's a couple paragraphs that just explains the principle itself, whether that's extreme ownership or no bad teams, only bad leaders, or whatever the principle is. And then they give a business example of that principle being put into place in business, because one of the things they do at their company called Echelon Front is they do leadership consulting for businesses. And so that's one of the really cool things about the book is they do such a great job of taking these lessons that they learned from the military and these principles that they learned from the military and applying those to everyday civilian life, whether that's in your personal life or in your business life. So that's how they structure this book. And like I said, that's what Jocko is doing on each one of his podcasts, is taking those stories and mapping them onto the principles laid out in this book. So with that context, let's dive in to the first principle. The first principle is extreme ownership. It's the title of the book. And if you don't know too much about Jocko, you've still probably heard this idea of extreme ownership from Jocko. It's exactly what it sounds like. I'm going to quote from the book here. It says, on any team in any organization, all responsibility for success and failure rests with the leader. The leader must own everything in his or her world. There is no one else to blame. The leader must acknowledge mistakes and admit failures, take ownership of them, and develop a plan to win. So when I think about the idea of extreme ownership, a lot of the guys that we've studied so far on the podcast come to mind. But really the first one that I think of is Jensen Huang, who's the CEO and founder of Nvidia. And as you read the book, The Nvidia Way by Tai Kim, you can see how much ownership Jensen is taking of the company's failures and shortcomings along the way. And there's a few stories I wanted to highlight in the book. So the first one comes from really early on in Nvidia's story. Their first two products were essentially failures. They did not go well, and it was really questionable after their first two product launches if the company was going to survive. And that very first product was called the NV1. And so after the NV1 failure, Jensen takes ownership of the situation. So here we go, diving in on the book. It says, Jensen believed that it came down to his own shortcomings as the leader of a new company. We were just bad at our jobs, Jensen said. The first 5 years of our company, we had really talented people working super, super hard, but building a company is a new skill. Jensen vowed he would absorb as much as he could about leading a business to prevent himself and his fledgling company from ever making the same mistakes again. So you can see out of the gate, Jensen, after they're unsuccessful with the NV1, he's taking ownership and he's saying, I was bad at my job. And one of the things I really liked from that paragraph is Jensen says, building a company is a new skill. This is an idea that Jocko talks about all the time. He talks about how leadership is a skill and you've got to put the time in to learn that skill set of leadership. And so you can see Jensen saying here, hey, building a company is a new skill. I didn't have that skill. I needed to understand my shortcomings and the company's shortcomings to make sure that we didn't make those mistakes again. Another story from later on in the book covers the NV30. So that was another product that ends up not going well. At the time, Nvidia actually hires, I want to say it was about 100 engineers from a company called 3DFX that was going out of business. And so as these 100 employees and engineers from 3DFX join the Nvidia team, there ends up being some troubles that arise because the teams aren't communicating effectively with one another. And you have a hardware team and software team that aren't talking together, which leads to the product ultimately not meeting the levels of performance that it needs to meet. And therefore the product kind of fails when they launch it into the market. And we're going to see Jensen take ownership in this situation again. Diving in on the book, it says Jensen reflected on the NV30's failures. Ultimately, it was his responsibility to ensure that NVIDIA's teams collaborated effectively, no matter how large the company got. And I'm going to jump forward a little bit to where it talks about the lessons that Jensen learns from this situation. It says, it was not enough to look at external measures of success, revenue, profitability, the price of the stock, or the pace of product launches. A truly sustainable business spent just as much effort looking inward in order to keep its internal culture aligned. As Nvidia established itself as the dominant player in the graphics industry, the company's executives got distracted by its partners, its investors, and its finances. It failed to see the growing problem within its own walls, complacency, and it was almost destroyed because of it. So I thought that was a really interesting story. You see here that Jensen is taking responsibility and ownership for the fact that NVIDIA's teams are not collaborating effectively. And one of his main takeaways is, hey, we as an organization have been looking at a lot of these external measures of success, but that has caused us to take our eye off the ball of our internal culture. And one of the things they needed to do was make sure that they fight complacency within their own company, right? And they need to work on that internal culture, which is really interesting because, right, I mean, that's what this book is all about. It's, hey, what are the principles that you need as your culture inside your company to make sure that your teams and your company continue to dominate and win in the space that they are operating in. So I thought that was just really good examples from the book, The Nvidia Way, and Jensen showing what extreme ownership looks like in action and showing how if you take ownership of the situation, it allows you to see the mistakes and failures that you're making along the way so that you can make the adjustments and not make those mistakes again. And that's something that Jensen was really well known for and enforcing throughout his organization, is not making the same mistake twice. All right, moving on to the second principle in the book. And this principle is that there are no bad teams, only bad leaders. And this story from the military section of the principle in the book Extreme Ownership, it's a really interesting story. It's one of those stories that's really stuck with me ever since the first time I read it. And the story is written by Leif, and he's talking about when he was an instructor at BUDS, which is the basic underwater demolition SEAL training, which if you've heard of Hell Week or you see the videos of the guys carrying logs or carrying boats on their head, that is the BUDS training. And the story that Leif tells from this chapter is a story about two different boat crews. So at BUDS, the SEALs get broken up into these different, I want to say it's like 6 or 7 man teams. And each one of those teams is called a boat crew. And those boat crews compete against one another in all of these different competitions and races. And he tells a story of Boat Crew 2 and Boat Crew 6. So Boat Crew 2 was this really high performing team, and they're winning most of the races and most of the competitions, and they've got a really strong leader. And then Boat Crew 6 is the team that is losing all the races. They're coming in last all the time, and they do not have a strong leader. And so what the instructors decide to do is they take the leader from Boat Crew 2, who's the good, effective leader who's on the winning team, and they put him as the leader of Boat Crew 6, and they take the leader from Boat Crew 6 and put him on Boat Crew 2. So they swap the two leaders to see what happens. And what ends up happening is Boat Crew 6, now that they have the really good and effective leader, they start competing for first place against Boat Crew 2. So those two boat crews end up kind of fighting neck and neck for first and second place in the competitions. And really the takeaway from that story is, hey, there's no bad teams, there's only bad leaders. Whenever they took the good leader from Boat Crew 2 and put him in Boat Crew 6, Boat Crew 6 became one of the top performing teams just by switching the person who was leading that team, which is a really interesting story to think about the impact that a single person can have on the performance of a team. And when I think about this principle and the books that we've studied so far, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the story of Steve Jobs coming back to Apple. So in 1985, I believe it is, Steve Jobs gets ousted from Apple. So Apple's doing well, they're growing. He builds it. Steve Jobs is at the helm. In 1985, the board decides to remove Steve Jobs from the company. Steve Jobs is gone for 12 years and ends up coming back in 1997. I believe that's correct. And in 1997, when he comes back, they're like 90 days away from being insolvent. So they're in a very bad spot. And so Steve Jobs comes back in and he does a great job turning around the company very, very quickly. And as we all know, I think it's by 2011, Apple becomes the most valuable company in the world. And so Steve Jobs does a fantastic job of completely turning the company around. It's kind of like that Boat Crew 2 and Boat Crew 6 story, right? I mean, they literally took one leader out, replaced it with another one. Apple starts going down. They put Steve Jobs back in, and he turns the company around. So it's really interesting to see how much one person can really change the trajectory of an organization. And one of the really interesting concepts from this book, it's from the introduction, Jocko writes that the only meaningful measure for a leader is whether a team succeeds or fails. For all the definitions, descriptions, and characterizations of leaders, there are only two that matter: effective and ineffective. And so as I was doing the Steve Jobs podcast, that was one of the things that I was thinking of is, hey, there's a lot of people who critique Steve Jobs. They say he's not a good leader, or he's not a good manager, or he was bad at this or bad at that. But at the end of the day, he was the boat crew leader that got put back into the game and turned the company around and built them into one of the most valuable companies in the world. And you can't really argue the fact that he was effective at turning Apple around when other leaders were not. So I think that was just a really interesting example that I've seen of a company swapping out the person in the leadership position and that person turning the company around. So like I said, that just reinforces that idea that there's no bad teams, only bad leaders. Moving on to principle number 3. This principle is believe. And that this is another one where Jocko has a really good story in the military section of this principle. And he talks about how the senior leadership in the military had asked the Navy SEALs and the American troops to bring Iraqi troops alongside them on their missions. And Jocko talks about in the book how at first, his initial reaction and his guys' initial reactions were, hey, why do you want us to bring these untrained guys with us on these highly dangerous missions, right? We're safer without bringing those guys along with us. Why are you forcing us to bring these Iraqi troops on these missions with us? And Jocko talks about how he kind of comes to the realization where, hey, if we don't teach the Iraqi troops how to defend their own country, we are going to be here forever. So we've got to get these Iraqis trained up. And then he talks about how once he understood the why behind what he was doing, he was able to kind of buy in and see, okay, I understand why leadership is asking me to do this. And so they kind of tie that into the principle of, as a leader, you need to understand why you're doing what you're doing. You need to believe in the mission. From the book, it says, in order to convince and inspire others to follow and accomplish a mission, the leader must be a true believer in the mission. So when I think back on the people we've covered on the podcast so far, and I think about the principle of believe, the first person that comes to mind for me is Elon Musk, right? He's got SpaceX going on where he's trying to make life multiplanetary. He's got Tesla where he's trying to make the earth more sustainable and move it toward electric vehicles and solar energy. And one of the things that Walter Isaacson talks about, and Walter Isaacson is the author of Elon Musk's biography that we covered on the podcast, is he talks about how kind of when he initially met Elon, he didn't know if the mission was kind of like more of a pep rally talk or if Elon Musk like really believed in those missions. And so I'm going to quote Walter Isaacson from the book. It says, with the conviction of a prophet, Elon would speak about the need to nurture the flame of human consciousness, fathom the universe, and save our planet. At first, I thought this was mainly role-playing, the team-boosting pep talks and podcast fantasies of a man-child who had read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy once too often. But the more I encountered it, the more I came to believe that his sense of mission was part of what drove him. While other entrepreneurs struggled to develop a worldview, he developed a cosmic view. And there's a story from a little bit later in the book where SpaceX's board is actually talking about the design of the SpaceX spacesuit years before SpaceX is actually flying people into space. And they're talking about the design of the spacesuits that people are going to wear on Mars decades before SpaceX is going to get people to Mars. And they're talking about these conversations as though they're totally normal conversations to have. That's how much Elon and the entire SpaceX board has bought into that mission, is that they're genuinely talking about the government structure on Mars and the spacesuits that people are going to wear on Mars decades ahead of time. That's how much they've all bought into that mission and really believe in what they're doing. So that's definitely, when I think of the principle believe and believing in what you're doing, Elon Musk and his work at SpaceX and Tesla is the first thing that comes to mind from the people that we've studied so far on the podcast. All right, moving on to principle number 4. This is all about checking your ego and keeping your ego in check so that you are able to recognize whenever you make mistakes and also learn from those mistakes so you can change your behavior going forward. So taking a quote from the book, they write, implementing extreme ownership requires checking your ego and operating with a high degree of humility. Admitting mistakes, taking ownership, and developing a plan to overcome challenges are integral to any successful team. Ego can prevent a leader from conducting an honest, realistic assessment of his or her own performance and the performance of the team. And then a little bit further on in the section, they write, but we can't ever think we are too good to fail or that our enemies are not capable, deadly, and eager to exploit our weaknesses. We must never get complacent. This is where controlling the ego is most important. So that's what they say here. You've got to have your ego in check so you can understand when you're making mistakes and not get complacent and make the improvements going forward, right? And so when I think about keeping your ego in check and not being complacent and learning from your mistakes. The first person that comes to mind is Sam Walton. One of the favorite things I've read in the last year as I've been doing this podcast is this description of Sam Walton from David Glass. And David Glass says the two things about Sam Walton that distinguish him from almost everyone else I know. First, he gets up every day bound and determined to improve something. Second, he is less afraid of being wrong than anyone I've ever known. And once he sees he's wrong, he just shakes it off and heads in another direction. So that second one, he's not afraid of being wrong. He's more okay with that than anyone else he's ever met. So Sam Walton has his ego in check. He's totally okay with being wrong. Once he is wrong, he shakes it off and heads in the other direction. And what does that allow him to do? That circles back to the first point that David Glass makes. He says he gets up every day bound and determined to improve something. So Sam Walton is totally okay with being wrong, okay with seeing whatever mistakes that they make, and then he learns from those and he goes and makes the necessary improvements. And so if we go back to the book, one of the things that the autobiography that Sam Walton wrote, he talks about Saturday morning meetings and how they all get together to talk about the mistakes that they make and the adjustments that they're going to make from those learnings. So diving in on the book, it says the only other reason the thing held together back then is that from the very start, we would all get our managers together once a week and critique ourselves. We wanted everybody to know what was going on and everybody to be aware of the mistakes we made. I'm going to say that again. We wanted everyone to be aware of the mistakes we made. So they would get all the managers together to talk about the mistakes they made. Back to the book. It said when somebody made a bad mistake, whether it was myself or anybody else, we talked about it, admitted it, and tried to figure out how to correct it, and then moved on to the next day's work. And it is just a fantastic example of Sam Walton keeping his ego in check. He talks about even if the mistake is his own, they're going to talk about it, and building a culture across the entire company where people are able to keep their egos in check and learn from those mistakes. So I just love that example from Sam Walton. There's so many more examples of folks like Chesty Puller and others keeping their egos in check as well, but I can't tell all the stories that I highlighted for this because then this podcast would take forever. But Sam Walton's was definitely really great. And I just love that quote from David Glass about the two things that made Sam Walton unique. All right, moving on to the next principle. This is going to take us into the second section of the book, which is the laws of combat. So those are cover and move, simple, prioritize and execute, and decentralized command. So the first one is cover and move. In the military section of this chapter, Leif tells a story about how he's with a group of SEALs and they are out on the battlefield in Ramadi and they need to make their way back to the base. And essentially him and the group of SEALs work with one another. I want to say they call it leapfrogging, where one group of SEALs covers for the other while they move and they kind of leapfrog back to the base and they end up getting back to the base safely. But when they get there, a SEAL who was at the base the entire time comes up to Leif and was like, hey man, what were you doing? There was a sniper element out there that could have covered your guys' entire movement back to the base, but you didn't coordinate your movements with them. Like, why didn't you do that? That would have been safer for everybody. And Leif kind of talks about how he lost sight of that resource that was the snipers that could have been watching out for them. So diving in on the book, they write, within any team, there are divisions that arise. Often when smaller teams within the team get so focused on their immediate tasks, they forget about what others are doing and how they depend on other teams. So that's exactly what happened in the Leif situation. He was focused on his immediate task and what his team was doing, and he forgot to think about what other folks were out there were doing and how they could help him accomplish his mission. So as I think about that story, the first story that comes to my mind from what we covered on the podcast is back to the NV30 story from the Nvidia way, talking about Jensen Huang and Nvidia. And we talked about in the extreme ownership principle how there are some miscommunications between the hardware and the software team after Nvidia hires 100 employees from 3DFX and how those teams aren't communicating with one another. So here we go, diving in. This is a quote from the book, The Nvidia Way. It says, confusion reigned both from the lack of clear guidelines from Microsoft and from lack of coordination between Nvidia's own teams. A former employee remembers an incident when a group of hardware and software engineers were standing in a cubicle and looking at the lackluster performance data from the NV30 during its development phase. One perplexed software engineer said that it was almost as if the hardware fog shader feature had been removed. The hardware architect replied, "Oh yeah, we took that out. Nobody used that." The software team was stunned. Nvidia's hardware team did not consult anyone before they removed it, nor did they seem to understand how important it was. All of a sudden, it was as though Nvidia's various teams were siloed, the very kind of organizational structure the company had rejected from the start. All right, so that story, it almost sounds like the same story as Leif's story, right? You've got these two teams, you got the hardware team and the software team, and they're both so focused on what they're doing that they're not coordinating with each other to understand how the decisions that the hardware team is making is affecting the software team and vice versa, right? So that's what this principle is about, is cover and move. And one of the things that I think about when I think about this section and this principle of cover and move is how important it is for you and for like me, whatever team I'm in, to remember to push what they call situational awareness, right? What I'm doing and what my team is doing, make sure to let other people know in our organization what we are doing so that they can make the appropriate adjustments, and also make sure that you understand what those other teams are doing so that you can understand how they can help you accomplish your mission or how you can help them accomplish their mission and what they're setting out to do. So it's one of those principles, cover and move, teamwork. It seems so simple. It seems like something that we've been taught, since we were 3 or 4 years old playing soccer together, but it's so easy to get siloed and to just focus in on what you're doing and to lose sight of the bigger picture and how you and your teammates can cover for one another. And this example from the Nvidia way is just another really good example of what happens when we forget to do that. All right, moving on to principle number 6, which is simple. And so I'm going to take a quote from the book here. It says, "Simplifying as much as possible is crucial to success. When plans and orders are too complicated, people may not understand them. And when things go wrong, and they inevitably will go wrong, complexity compounds issues that can spiral out of control into total disaster. Plans and orders must be communicated in a manner that is simple, clear, and concise." So when I think about this principle, the first person that comes to mind is hands down Steve Jobs. Apple and Steve Jobs were notorious for making incredibly simple products. There's this line that says, "Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication." And Steve Jobs, we talked about in that podcast, so many of the ways that he worked to simplify things as much as possible, right? It even talks about how they gave a 6-year-old illiterate boy an iPad, and I don't think he spoke English. And within minutes, he was able to operate the iPad and play a game with no one giving him any instructions on how to use the iPad. It was just that intuitive that this 6-year-old illiterate boy was able to just pick it up and start playing games on it. And, we talked about how Steve Jobs took the on and off buttons off of his products because you didn't need them, right? That's how obsessed he was with simplifying things as much as he could. Another person I think of when I think of this idea of keeping things simple is Elon Musk. I should touch on the story or the business story from the book, from this chapter. They talk about how the leadership of a company sets up this incentive structure that's really complicated and has all of these weights, and the workers at the company don't know what they're incentivized to do because the incentive plan is too complex. So it's a story about how things go wrong when things aren't simple and when goals and incentives aren't simple. And one of the things Elon does an incredible job of is making the goals really simple. There's this one story where it talks about how they needed to make 5,000 cars per week at the Tesla Gigafactory. That was the goal that they had to hit. It was very simple. Another goal for Tesla Autopilot was the number of miles driven without intervention. These are singular goals that can align an entire team and have them push toward these really simple goals with simple metrics. And another line that I think of when I think about this concept is from Charlie Munger. He says, in business, we often find that the winning system goes almost ridiculously far in maximizing or minimizing one or a few variables. And so that's what Elon is doing here. What is the one or two variables that we need to optimize for our business to be successful? He's just very good at making these simple metrics that if they can optimize those, the entire company is going to be successful. Moving on to principle number 7. This is the principle of prioritize and execute. So I'm going to dive in from the book Extreme Ownership. It says, even the most competent of leaders can be overwhelmed if they try to tackle multiple problems or a number of tasks simultaneously. The team will likely fail at each of those tasks. Instead, leaders must determine the highest priority task and execute. When overwhelmed, fall back upon this principle, prioritize and execute. So when I think about this principle, the first person who comes to mind again is Steve Jobs, and he does this thing called the top 100 retreat. So he would bring the top 100 employees from Apple. They would all go on this retreat, and during that retreat, one of the things that they would do is they would list out all the things that they wanted to accomplish over the next year. And they would end up narrowing that list down to a list of 10 items or 10 priorities that they would have. And then at the end of that conversation, Steve Jobs walked up to the board and he crossed off the bottom 7, leaving only the top 3 items left on the list. And he said, hey, we can only do these 3. These are the 3 things we have to focus on. If we try to focus on more than these top 3 items, we're going to fail. So even a company as large as Apple that has all of these resources that can accomplish all of these different things, that's one of the things that Steve Jobs is relentlessly trying to do, is slash things that aren't a priority so that they can make sure they execute really, really well on the few things that they need to execute on. And another story, when Steve Jobs comes back in 1997, he comes back to Apple. That's one of the first things he does. Apple has all of these different products and they have all these different versions of each product. And Steve Jobs is like, hey, I don't even know what I should recommend to my friends to buy. There's way too many of these. And so one of the first things he does is just start slashing a bunch of products and focusing his team on the few products that they need to do. He ends up focusing them on 4 different product lines that they need to execute on. So that's one of the things that Steve Jobs is just really, really good at, is even though Apple had all of these resources and this really big team, focusing them down to just a few products that they needed to execute on. That's something that he was really good at. Another couple examples, Jeff Bezos early on in the Amazon days, he always wanted Amazon to be more than just books, but for several years, he focuses Amazon solely on books because he knows that they need to focus in order to execute and get to the scale that they want to execute on. And I'm also reminded of the Charlie Munger line that we just covered in the last section, that the winning teams often are just maximizing or minimizing one or a few variables. That falls under both simplicity and prioritizing. If you can narrow things down to where you just have 1 or 2 or 3 variables that you are optimizing for, that means you've prioritized effectively. All right, moving on to principle number 8. This is a principle of decentralized command. And so it's exactly what it sounds like. You've got a decentralized command. You've got to let people make decisions. You cannot have all the decision-making authority at the top of the organization. So when I think about this principle, the first person that came to mind was Sam Walton. And there's a section of the book that's incredible where Sam lays out 6 ways that Walmart tries to think small. And one of those ways, it's number 4 on his list, is this idea of pushing responsibility and authority down. So here we go. I'm going to quote, this is Sam Walton's autobiography that I'm about to quote. He writes, "The bigger we get as a company, the more important it becomes for us to shift responsibility and authority toward the front lines, toward the department manager who's stocking the shelves and talking to the customer. When we were much smaller, I probably wasn't as quick to catch on to this idea as I should have been," right? So that's exactly what Jocko is talking about when he's talking about decentralized command. He's talking about putting that authority in the people who are on the front lines, who are talking to customers, or who are out there on the front lines of the battlefield, or whatever situation it may be. And it's really interesting to see Sam Walton say, I probably wasn't as quick to catch on to this idea as I should have been. You can hear that's Sam Walton telling us, hey, I messed this up early on. I didn't implement decentralized command as early as I should have. I was probably late to implementing decentralized command in my organization. So that's why when I'm listing out these 6 principles that I need people to follow and how Walmart thinks small, this idea of pushing responsibility and authority down the chain is one of those principles that he lists out. Another really great example of this idea of decentralized command comes from the book Titan, which is the biography on John D. Rockefeller. And in that book, Ron Chernow, the author, writes, to orchestrate such a gigantic operation, Rockefeller had to delegate authority. And part of the Standard Oil gospel was to train your subordinate to do your job. And then this is Rockefeller talking about how he trains recruits. Rockefeller says, has anyone given you the law of these offices? No, it is this. Nobody does anything if he can get anybody else to do it. As soon as you can, get someone whom you can rely on, train him in the work, sit down, cock your heels up, and think out some way for the Standard Oil to make some money, right? So that's Rockefeller saying the exact same thing here. For him to be successful, for him to run Standard Oil, he needed to be able to delegate authority across all of these different lieutenants that he had under him. And he's training his recruits, hey, as soon as you can, delegate authority, delegate your job, push that down the chain to people who can start running that so you can move up in the organization and look out and figure out more ways for Standard Oil to make money. So I thought those were both just really good examples from Sam Walton and from John D. Rockefeller about how they implemented decentralized command inside of their companies so that their companies could continue to grow and operate at scale. All right, so that wraps up the laws of combat. Now we are moving into the third section of the book, which is sustaining victory. And so the first principle, this is the 9th principle on the list, is plan. So when I think about this principle of planning, I'm reminded of a few of the quotes that I bumped into through different books that we've covered on the podcast. So the first one that I thought of was one of the quotes from one of the letters that John D. Rockefeller wrote to his son. So in that letter, Rockefeller wrote, having a purpose is the basis of my leadership, and it is everything. I'm accustomed to establishing goals before doing anything. And every day I have to set goals, countless goals, such as the purpose of talking with partners, the purpose of convening meetings, the purpose of making plans, and so on. Before doing something, I will also review the purpose that I have set. Another quote from Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos says, you know the business plan won't survive its first encounter with reality, but the discipline of writing the plan forces you to think through some of the issues and get sort of mentally comfortable in the space. And then you start to understand if you push on this knob, this one will move over here and so on. So that's the first step, right? So that's these guys talking about how important planning is. Another quote that I really liked was from Naval Ravikant. And one of the things that he said was, I want to live my life in a way that if it played out 1,000 times, Naval is successful 999 times. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of frame for planning your life, or how to think about planning your life, is how do I plan out my life so that if it were played out 1,000 times, I'm successful 999 of those times. I think that's a really interesting frame to think about planning your life and what you're going to be doing. One of the other things from this chapter that was a really big takeaway for me and how I've operated over the last 10 years is this idea of doing a debrief. So I'm going to dive into the book Extreme Ownership here. It says the best teams employ constant analysis of their tactics and measure their effectiveness so that they can adopt their methods and implement lessons learned for future missions. Often business teams claim there isn't time for such analysis, but one must make the time. The best SEAL units, after each combat operation, conduct what we call a post-operational debrief. No matter how exhausted from an operation or how busy planning for the next mission, time is made for this debrief because lives and future mission success depend on it. A post-operational debrief examines all phases of an operation from planning through execution in a concise format. It addresses the following for the combat mission just completed. What went right? What went wrong? How can we adapt our tactics to make us even more effective and increase our advantage over the enemy? Such self-evaluation allows SEAL units to reevaluate, enhance, and refine what worked and what didn't so they can constantly improve. It is critical for the success of any team and any business to do the same and implement those changes into their future plans so they don't repeat the same mistake. So I just love this idea of debriefs, and we already touched on this a little bit in the check the ego section about how Walmart did these debriefs. Right? We talked about the Saturday morning meetings where all these managers would come in, and we talked about how they kept their ego in check, but this is what they were doing. They were doing a debrief. On Saturdays, they would look back at the previous week and say, hey, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? What can we learn from the mistakes that we made? And how can we make sure that we take those lessons and take them to our future mission so we don't make the same mistakes again? Moving on to principle number 10. This is the principle of leading up and down the chain of command. So I'll highlight the idea of leading up the chain of command because that's one that's really stuck with me ever since I read it in this book. It's the idea of how can you lead up the chain of command? What can you do to make sure that you're pushing situational awareness up the chain so that people above you understand what you're seeing on the ground, and you can help them understand that and make the correct decisions with that information. So here we go, diving in from the principle section of the book. It says, if your boss isn't making a decision in a timely manner or providing necessary support for you and your team, don't blame the boss. First, blame yourself. Examine what you could do better to convey the critical information for decisions to be made and support allocated. So I just think it's a really interesting principle. I remember it was just a new concept for me of this idea of leading up the chain and leading your boss to make sure that they're making the right decisions. And when I think about this principle, the first one that comes to mind is a guy named David Glass who works for Sam Walton at Walmart. And one of the things that David Glass does a great job at is convincing Sam Walton to invest more into computers and to technology so that they can streamline their operations. So here we go. I'm going to dive in on the book. This is from Sam Walton's autobiography. Sam writes, some of our guys around here find it amusing that I get so much credit for Walmart's reputation as a world leader in retailing and distribution technology. It's not because we're not on the cutting edge. We are. They're amused because, as I told you, ever since I went to that IBM school in 1966, I've put up a pretty good fight every time somebody wants to buy some new system for this, that, or the other thing. I want them to think hard about how they're going to justify the expense before they even come to me with it. But there's no question about it. One of the main reasons we've been able to roll this company out nationally was all the pressure put on me by guys like David Glass and earlier Jack Shoemaker and Ron Mayer to invest so heavily in technology. Yes, I argued and resisted, but I eventually signed the checks, and we have been able to move way out in front of the industry in both communications and distribution. And so I just think that's a really good example of Sam Walton saying, hey, we were able to be the leader in the technology for retailing and distribution because I had guys like David Glass who were pushing me to invest in this equipment. And later on in the book, it says, from the time David Glass came on board in 1976, he's been pushing me to invest in that system. And thank goodness he managed to be so persuasive. So that's just Sam Walton saying, hey, David Glass did a great job leading up the chain of command. I intentionally made it hard to invest in new things because I wanted the guys to think about those investments and make sure that they were pay off. But at the same time, I needed those guys to push on me and be persuasive to make sure that I was making the right decisions. And David Glass and these other guys were very effective at doing that. So I just thought that was a really good example from Sam Walton talking about certain guys that he had on his team that did a great job leading up the chain of command so that Walmart ended up succeeding. And moving on to principle number 11, this principle is decisiveness and uncertainty. So I'm going to start with a quote from the book. It says, there's no 100% right solution. The picture is never complete. Leaders must be comfortable with this and be able to make decisions promptly, then be ready to adjust those decisions quickly based on evolving situations and new information. Intelligence gathering and research are important, but they must be employed with realistic expectations and must not impede swift decision-making that is often the difference between victory and defeat. Waiting for the 100% right and certain solution leads to delay, indecision, and an inability to execute. Leaders must be prepared to make an educated guess based on previous experience, knowledge of how the enemy operates, likely outcomes, and whatever intelligence is available in the immediate moment. So when I read that section from the book and I think about being decisive amid uncertainty, one of the first things I think about is Jeff Bezos. So in one of his letters to shareholders, he talks about how important it is to have a organizational culture that supports high velocity decision making. As a culture, you want to move quickly through decisions and make as many decisions as you can as quickly as possible. You want to move at a high velocity. And one of the things that he lays out in how you build an organization that moves at a high velocity, he says that you should be making decisions with somewhere around 70% of the information that you wish you had, right? And so if we go back, one of the things Jocko says is there's no 100% right solution. The picture is never complete. That's what Bezos is saying here. You won't have a complete picture of what you're walking into before you make the decision. You've got to get comfortable making decisions with about 70% of the information you wish you had. And one of the things Jocko talks about, he probably touches on it in the book, but I know he talks about it on podcasts, is one of the things that he does is he tries to break decisions down into smaller and smaller components, right? The smaller you can make the decision, the less impact it'll have, and the more you can iterate that as you continue to get more information. And Jeff Bezos talks about something very similar. He talks about 1- and 2-way door decisions. So a 1-way door decision is one where, hey, if you make that decision, it's really hard to walk it back. It's hard to walk back through that door. Once you go through it, you've made that decision and you've got to go down that path. Versus a 2-way door decision, which is one where if you make the decision and you go through the door and you see that it was wrong for whatever reason, you can easily walk back through that door. And so one of the things Bezos says is anytime someone brings him a 1-way door decision, he'll try to figure out how he can make that a 2-way door decision. Maybe it's a smaller step or a smaller decision. That's a 2-way door decision that will allow them to get some more information before they have to make the big 1-way door decision. And I think that aligns perfectly with what Jocko talks about when he says he tries to break down decisions into smaller and smaller and smaller chunks, which allows him to appear more decisive because he's making more decisions, but he's actually making small decisions over and over again, and allows him to get more information as he goes along. So he just breaks those decisions down, and as he makes each small decision, he gets a little bit more data that allows him to kind of course correct as he goes and move at a high velocity. So that was the first thing that I thought of when I think about decisiveness and uncertainty, is Jeff Bezos talking about making decisions with about 70% of the information that you wish you had. Another one of the examples I think about is from Elon Musk and the book that Walter Isaacson wrote. They talk about how Elon had over-automated the factory for Tesla and the one that was building cars. And so Elon's got to go through this factory and he starts spray painting an X on all the machines that he wants taken out of the factory that he wants to replace with humans. And he talks about how he knows he's going to be making wrong decisions, but he has to make decisions very quickly to get Tesla to where they need to be. And so he even says, hey, 20% of the decisions I'm about to make will be wrong, but I have to make these decisions quickly. And so I think that's just really interesting. It's kind of the opposite side of the coin. Like he's saying, like, hey, I know that don't have all the information. And so what's the result of that is I'm going to make bad decisions, and about 20% of the decisions I make are going to be incorrect, and just acknowledging that up front. So moving on to the last principle from the book, it's this principle that discipline equals freedom. And the entire chapter, at least for me, really the main takeaway is this idea that you've got to be disciplined in order to fight complacency so that you have the freedom that you want to have. And in the chapter on the military section, Jocko describes a story about how the guys on the SEAL teams, they didn't really have a procedure for collecting intelligence and evidence inside of a building once they were wrapping up their mission. So they would go out there, they would go into these buildings, they would try to capture or kill bad guys, and then they would need to gather and collect evidence. And the SEALs would essentially just ransack the place. And he talks about how he puts a guy in charge of coming up with a process to make that procedure more streamlined so that they could be disciplined in the way that they go about gathering and collecting the evidence so that they could then go operate more missions. And so Jocko tasks the guy to come up with that plan. And initially, the rest of the guys on the SEAL teams just have a bunch of pushback to the change. They say, hey, this is going to take us way longer. This is going to be dangerous for us to do. It's going to take way too long. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so they just get all of this immediate pushback when they're trying to figure out ways to do this evidence collection in a more streamlined manner. And so Jocko talks about how he ends up taking those guys out to do a few practice runs. And beforehand, it took him about 45 minutes to collect the evidence and kind of scan the building. And then once they implemented this new process, they got it down to 10 minutes. And so once they obviously did the run throughs, the guys were able to see, okay, this does work a lot better. This is a lot more effective. And since they were able to start clearing buildings and gathering evidence more quickly, that allowed them to the freedom to do more operations in a single night. If they were able to, take that process of gathering evidence from 45 minutes down to 10 minutes, that then allowed them to do more missions, 2 or 3 missions in a single night, which is, the freedom that they wanted to have. These guys want to go out and do these missions. And so that's really the lesson from that story that Jocko tells is, hey, by being disciplined in our processes and making sure we're fighting complacency and not just doing things the way we have been because we've always done them, that is what's going to allow us to make the adjustments that we need to so that we can have more freedom in the future to do the things that we want to do. And so that's why this chapter for me is just really highlighting this idea of how important it is to fight complacency within an organization. So there's a couple of examples of that we've covered on the podcast before. One of the first ones that sticks out to me is the idea from Jensen Huang, where he talks about how at Nvidia, we're always 30 days away from going out of business. So I'll take a quote from the book, The Nvidia Way. Jensen runs the company in the way he does because he believes that Nvidia's worst enemy is not the competition, but itself. More specifically, the complacency that grips any successful company, particularly one with a long and impressive track record, such as Nvidia, right? So I just think that's fascinating. It says Jensen Huang is running the company in a way to fight off the complacency that grips any successful company. I think about Warren Buffett's ABCs of business decay, arrogance, bureaucracy, and complacency. One of the things that Jeff Bezos talks about all the time is day one thinking and how you have to be operating your company as though it's day one, and that you've got to be fighting and clawing. And the second that you start thinking in day two thinking, you start thinking you've made it and you can relax, that's when the complacency is starting to creep in and you're going to start falling behind. And I've already covered it on this podcast, but one of the things I've loved so much from this podcast, and one of the things I found is the description of Sam Walton, is that he gets up bound and determined to improve something every single day, and that he's less afraid of being wrong than anyone I've ever known, right? That's how Sam Walton fights complacency and makes sure that he's constantly improving. So as I was thinking about this idea of discipline equals freedom, and as I was thinking about how to close out this podcast, I'm reminded of one of the ideas from Jocko that's really stuck with me over the years. And it's from Jocko podcast number 91. And someone made a clip of it and put it on YouTube. And I've listened to it probably at least 500 times, maybe 1,000 times, because I listen to it while I'm working out all the time. And it's a clip from the podcast. Probably in my head, it's something closer to like a poem, like the poem "If" from Kipling, right? Because I've listened to it so many times. And I think Jocko had it written down before he said it on the podcast. But it's this idea of fighting complacency and this idea that every second counts. And so I'm going to quote Jocko and what he says on that podcast here to close out the podcast. He says, "Rome wasn't built in a day. We all know that. Everyone hears that. But Rome also didn't fall apart overnight either. It took hundreds of years for Rome to reach its peak, but it also took time, hundreds of years, for Rome to decay and fall apart. And that is representative of life, because you don't achieve worthwhile goals quickly or easily. They take time, they take struggle, they take relentless pursuit day in and day out. That's what it takes. But also, things don't usually fall apart quickly either, at least at first. It's a slow process. A little slip here, a little setback over there, a little wearing down of discipline and will over time. That's the thing. Success and failure are generally slow processes, either slowly building things up or gradually tearing them down. And that's why I say you've got to pay attention. You have to watch. You have to watch every single second. because those seconds, they turn into minutes, and minutes turn into hours, and hours turn into days, and days turn into years. And so that second that just went by, that counted. And so did that second. And so did that one. And in those precious seconds, you're either building or you're decaying. You were either gaining ground or you were losing ground in that second. And in every second counts. So make every second count. So thank you, Jocko. Thank you for putting yourself out there in 2015 and writing this book and many of the other books you've published since then. Thank you for putting the podcast together and recording over 500 podcasts so far. Thank you for teaching us about human nature, both the bright side and the dark side of human nature. Thank you for having the humility to talk about the mistakes you made along the way. Thank you for teaching us how to get after it. And thank you for teaching a young 22-year-old kid how to grab the wheel of life and live. So thank you. It's had more of an impact than you know. Thanks, Jocko.